Welcome to the Sunday Signal. I am David Richards, MBE, technology entrepreneur, co-founder of Yorkshire AI Labs, and weekly columnist for the Yorkshire Post. This is issue 67 for Sunday, the 16th of August, 2026. Today's title, The Brain is Not the Bottleneck. 13 years ago, a group of Berkeley researchers sat in my office asking for money for a project called Spark. On Thursday, their company closed a $5 billion round at a $190 billion valuation, and their chief executive spent the week arguing that artificial general intelligence has already arrived and nobody has noticed. He is closer to right than the industry wants to admit, and the consequences land on payroll. Here is what is coming up. First, the story of that meeting, why it happened at all, which is down to one of the creators of Hadoop who worked for me and told me to go and look at the technology that would replace his own, and the story of the man who was sitting in front of me, whose entire career began with a broken computer in a Swedish suburb. Then the argument that got Ali Ghodsi more attention this week than $5 billion did, set against Demis Hassabis at Google DeepMind, who says 2029, then what artificial general intelligence actually means for the economy and for jobs once you take the science fiction out of it. Then my Yorkshire Post column this week about the underwriters in London who worked out that the human in the loop is the expensive part. And finally, the layoff tracker, week 33, led by Oracle, which has shed 21,000 roles in a single financial year while spending $55.7 billion on capital expenditure. If you are not yet subscribed, the newsletter is free and it is at thesundaysignal.ai. That is thesundaysignal.ai, a new issue every Sunday morning. If you're listening on Spotify, Apple Podcasts or YouTube, please follow the show. It takes 10 seconds and it genuinely helps. Let's get into it. Bottom line up front. The most valuable company in enterprise data was, in 2013, a handful of academics in my office who did not know how venture capital worked, sent there by the man who built the technology they were about to supersede. What separates then from now is not that the machines got clever, it is that the industry finally worked out where the money sits, and it does not sit in the model. Ali Ghodsi's claim that artificial general intelligence has already arrived is not a marketing line. Whatever else it also is. Measured against the definition researchers used before 2022, he is right. And the fact that your company looks exactly the same as it did 3 years ago is the whole point. Intelligence has become the cheap part. Context is the expensive part. And the third thing, the one nobody puts on a slide, is that the human standing between the model and the outcome has stopped being a safeguard and started being a cost. That is not a prediction. It is already showing up in insurance quotes, in Oracle's cash flow statement, and in the unemployment rate for graduates under 30. So, let me take you back to that office. In 2013, a group of researchers from Berkeley came to see me in Silicon Valley. They were not on my calendar by accident. They were there because of Konstantin Boudnik. Everybody called him Kos. He had joined us that year, and he ran advanced technologies and open source development, which in practice meant he ran R&D. Kos was one of the early developers of Apache Hadoop and a co-creator of Apache Bigtop, which packages, tests and validates components across the Hadoop ecosystem. He was close enough to Hadoop to recognize where its original processing model was beginning to fail. He knew Ion Stoica and Ali Ghodsi, and he was insistent about it. Meet them, he said. This is going to be the future. Consider what that meant, coming from him. Here was a man whose work was closely bound up with Hadoop, telling his chief executive to go and look hard at the technology most likely to displace part of it. Not many people do that. Most of us defend the thing we built long after the evidence has turned. So they came in. Ion Stoica, who would become Databricks' first chief executive, sat in front of me. Ali Ghodsi, then the VP of engineering. There were others in the room. They had built something in the AMP lab called Spark, and they had come looking for funding for what was still, in every meaningful sense, an academic project. The pitch was not hard to follow. Hadoop's MapReduce engine had carried the industry a long way and was visibly running out of road. Spark was a faster answer for a large class of those workloads, and it would go on running on Hadoop infrastructure for years afterwards, rather than sweeping it away. Cos was right about the direction. What none of us saw, including him, was the scale. To understand why they were in California at all, you have to go back to a broken cassette deck in a Swedish suburb. Godsey's family fled Iran in 1984. By his own account, they had about 24 hours to get out. Sweden was the destination, because Sweden was the country that would take them, which is what happens when the alternative is staying. He was 5 years old. They arrived with leather jackets and several layers of clothing, which is not what you wear to a Nordic winter, and the family had little money. Then came the computer, a Commodore 64, second-hand and partly broken. The tape recorder did not work, so no games would load. The only thing the machine could actually do was run code you typed into it yourself. There were manuals, he read them. By primary school, on his own account, he was coding all day, and he has been blunt about why. There was not much else to do, and he did not really have friends. That is the whole origin story, and it is worth pausing on, because it is a story about constraint rather than genius. Nobody bought that child a gateway to a career in distributed systems. They bought a cheap machine that did not work properly, and the fault in it turned out to be the feature. The rest of his education was similarly unplanned. He was absent from school roughly 70% of the time on account of programming through the night on American hours, which cost him a place at a good university and sent him further north. There he acquired a roommate who was doing a business degree, and the two of them could not understand what the other did. The roommate eventually settled the matter by telling Godsey that he would be his boss when they were finished. Godsey's response was to enroll on a business degree as well, on the grounds that he was not having that. He has since described that as the actual reason he holds an MBA. He took a doctorate at KTH in Stockholm, working on fully decentralized systems, the sort of architecture that later showed up underneath cryptocurrencies. He took a professorship. He came to the United States once, spent a summer in Palo Alto, and decided he hated it. Too much suburbia, too many large cars. Then in 2009, the Berkeley offer arrived, and he took it on the strict understanding that it was for 1 year only. The timing was better than anyone in the room realized. Around the middle of the 2000s, the industry had stopped being able to make individual computers meaningfully faster. Processors flatlined at roughly 3 gigahertz, and the work had to go somewhere, so it went into the data center. The data center became the computer. Berkeley's AMP lab was working on the software for that new machine at exactly the moment the new machine appeared. Spark itself came out of a side project. A researcher in the lab wanted to compete in the Netflix recommendation prize, found the existing tooling painful and slow, and asked for help. The work done to help him became Apache Spark. Godsey recalls that their entry tied on performance, but lost under the competition's submission time tiebreak. And then came 4 years of nobody wanting it. This is the part of the story that gets edited out of the retrospectives. They toured Silicon Valley, offering the technology away free, telling established companies to take it, commercialize it, put their own name on it, and keep the money. Berkeley hippies, in Godsey's phrase. The answer came back the same each time. This is academic. Some student wrote it. The student will leave and we will be holding the source code. They even placed students inside prospective adopters as summer interns, hoping the software would take root from within. It did not work. Godsey says competitors spread a simpler message. Spark only worked when the data fitted in memory. It was not true, and the truth barely mattered, because it was repeated at conferences with real marketing budgets behind it, and prospective customers arrived already believing it. Now, the venture capital. In 2013, Ben Horowitz turned up. He had heard about the work through Scott Schenker, a Berkeley professor whose previous company had just sold to VMware, and his message was simple. This is worth $100 billion, and nobody else is going to build it for you. They were not keen. They were engineers, and what engineers wanted was $200,000, small salaries, and a year to work on it. Their approach to valuation is the funniest thing in the whole story, and also the most revealing. They went round the founders individually, asking what number would make them accept an investment they did not want. The first said 20 million. The next said no, 25. It ratcheted up until somebody arrived at 35. Horowitz then came in, declined to haggle, valued the company at $50 million and told them to take it or leave it. They took it on the spot. When the money landed, they gathered round a laptop to look at the bank balance, saw 14 followed by 6 zeros, and got out a calculator to work out how much interest it would earn if they simply left it in the account. Godsey was on about $59,000 at Berkeley at the time, by his own account. He joined part-time and was, by his own admission, the least enthusiastic of the founders. He only committed properly when he realized the others were taking the entire research lab with them, and Berkeley would be empty. 7 co-founders incorporated Databricks in 2013. By 2014, the whispering campaign about memory had not stopped, so they went and settled it with a contest. In October of that year, a Databricks team, led by Reynolds Shin, sorted 100 terabytes in 23 minutes on 206 EC2 machines. The previous Hadoop MapReduce result had taken 72 minutes on 2,100 machines, 3 times faster on about a tenth of the hardware, with the data processed from disk rather than held in memory. Databricks and a team from UC San Diego jointly set the Daytona Gray sort record. Databricks then demonstrated a 1 petabyte sort in 234 minutes, although that larger run was not an official Daytona entry. The story reversed almost overnight. Companies that had spent 3 years declining the software started describing themselves as the Spark Company. Godsey has noted dryly that some of them claimed to have created it. And then the awkward bit. The technology was now everywhere, and the revenue was about $1 million. The board's assessment, delivered with the tact that boards are known for, was that they had less revenue than the local restaurants, that everyone else was making money from their work, and that they were not business people. Ion Stoica's leave of absence from Berkeley ran out, and he went back. A chief executive search began. Most of the founders concluded it had been a good run. Horowitz backed a founder instead. In January 2016, Godsey took over. His own explanation of why him is that he was the oldest after Stoica, and the others looked too young, which may be the most honest account of an executive appointment ever given. What he did next was not clever. It was disciplined, and it is worth writing down because it is the part founders skip. 1. He sold to the enterprise. Databricks had been trying to run a self-serve motion where users arrived and swiped a card. He stopped that and went after large corporations on a simple piece of arithmetic. Who will pay £10 million for a 1% improvement? Only an organization large enough that 1% is worth 10 million. Those organizations have bought software the same way for 30 years, through relationships. So he hired expensive salespeople on packages of around $350,000 in total target compensation, which appalled a man who had been on a professor's salary 2 years earlier. 2. He over-indexed the executive team on experience. 6 founders with doctorates had been trying to invent marketing, finance, and customer success from first principles, as though those were unsolved research problems. He ran 12 executive searches and hired 12 people who had done the job before, and he confined the company's originality to the technology. 3. He built proprietary enterprise features on top of the open source. Security, governance, the unglamorous work. Open source got the adoption, the paid layer got the money. Forbes reports roughly $12 million of sales in 2016. Godsey's own account of that first year is that they promised the board 10 million and came in at 13 or 14. Either way, the ceiling broke. Before that, $30,000 had felt like a law of physics, the number above which no customer would go. Then the $1 million deals started. The lakehouse came next, merging the flexibility of a data lake with the structure of a warehouse, and it worked well enough that the rest of the industry copied the idea. Mosaic ML was acquired in 2023 for $1.3 billion, which put private model training inside the enterprise. Then the money got silly. $10 billion at a $62 billion valuation in December 2024, past $100 billion in September 2025. In February this year, $5 billion of equity plus $2 billion of debt capacity at $134 billion. And on Thursday, a $5 billion strategic round at $190 billion post-money, led by Coatue with Blackstone, MGX and T. Rowe Price, and Sixth Street Growth coming in new. The company crossed a $7 billion revenue run rate in the second quarter, growing more than 80% year on year, and says it generated positive adjusted free cash flow over the previous 12 months. Lakebase, its serverless Postgres database aimed at AI agents, is past a $100 million run rate on its own. Databricks now serves more than 20,000 organizations. The detail that tells you the most is not the valuation. Godsey says Databricks initially set out to raise $1 billion and received about $15 billion of interest from the investors it approached. They took $5 billion. That is not a company raising because it needs cash. That is a company taking money because refusing it would be rude to the balance sheet. Now, why does any of this matter for artificial intelligence? Because the models are not the scarce thing. A frontier model can be swapped out next quarter for a cheaper one from a different continent, and increasingly is. What cannot be swapped is a company's own data, its permissions, its definitions, its history of what actually happened. Databricks sits on that. The three products the new money is going into make the point exactly. Lakebase, for the operational data that agents need. Genie, for the context buried across the business. And Unity AI Gateway, to route work between models and stop the token bill running away. Godsey told CNBC that token maxing has, in his words, freaked out the CFOs. Databricks sells the thermostat. One last number on this. Forbes currently estimates Godsey's wealth at roughly $5.5 billion, although its calculation still appears to be anchored to February's $134 billion valuation. Thursday's round makes the published figure stale, but nobody outside the cap table can calculate the new number with confidence. Either way, a 5-year-old arrives in Sweden with 24 hours notice and the wrong coat. He gets a broken computer because the working ones cost too much. He skips 70% of school. He takes a business degree out of spite. He does a doctorate, hates America on his first visit, comes for 1 year, and ends up running one of the most valuable private companies on earth. I am not telling that story because it is inspiring, though it is. I am telling it because the ingredient that made it possible was a broken tape deck. If the machine had worked, he might simply have played games. And I am telling the other half because of Cos. The person best placed to see what was coming was the person with the most invested in what came before, and he picked up the phone anyway. That is rarer than the technology, and it is worth more. Which brings me to the claim that got Godsey more attention this week than the $5 billion did. Artificial general intelligence, he says, has already arrived. His argument is that current systems already clear one older, broad threshold for general intelligence, a machine that performs the kinds of intellectual tasks humans perform and is smarter than most people most of the time. The industry has never shared a single definition, and systems that look general on benchmarks can still fail unpredictably on planning, reliability, and real-world execution. On the broad functional definition Godsey invokes, the claim is defensible. It is not a settled scientific conclusion. What everyone now means by artificial general intelligence is superintelligence, something that compresses the work of the world's researchers into seconds and simulates whole economies. On that definition, Godsey says plainly, it is not here, and it is not obvious that what we are currently building ever becomes it. He made the case in June at Databricks Data and AI Summit in San Francisco, in front of more than 30,000 attendees. He opened by asking how many of them thought artificial general intelligence had arrived. Roughly 90% said no. Then he asked the room to compute the reduced 12th dimensional spin boardism of the classifying space of the Lie group G2. Nobody obliged. The frontier models will have a go at it. Attempting the problem is not the same as solving it, but that was his point about breadth rather than infallibility. The line he built on that is the one worth keeping. AI, he said, doesn't have an intelligence problem. It has a context problem. Think of a brilliant mind in a locked room. It can reason about anything you describe to it, and it has no idea what is happening outside the door. Ask it a specific question about your business, and it will fail. Not because it is stupid, but because it has never seen your ledger. It does not know which table is authoritative. It cannot tell you when your fiscal quarter closes, and it has no idea why the same metric appears twice with different values. Build a cleverer model, and it fails in exactly the same way. Now the other side, Demis Hassabis at Google DeepMind, has spent this year tightening rather than loosening his timeline. At Google's developer conference in May, he described us as standing in the foothills of the singularity and told Axios that while he still broadly expects artificial general intelligence around 2030, he now regards 2029 as possible. In February, at the India AI Impact Summit, he put the scale of it at roughly 10 times the impact of the Industrial Revolution, arriving at 10 times the speed, over a decade rather than a century. His position is that scaling alone will not close the remaining gaps in planning, memory, and reasoning, and that one or two more scientific breakthroughs are required. Greg Brockman of OpenAI, sharing the Databricks stage in June, declined to pick a date at all. His formulation was that artificial general intelligence is, in his words, almost a spectrum, not a moment, which is either wisdom or a way of never being wrong. So who is right? My reading is that Hassabis is describing a scientific threshold, while Godsey is describing the point at which machine intelligence becomes commercially substitutable. Only the second one is arguably behind us. On a growing range of bounded cognitive tasks, today's models already outperform many of the workers doing them. And that is the finding that should worry anyone with a desk. Godsey's argument does not depend on a breakthrough. It depends on plumbing, which is convenient for him, since plumbing is what he sells, and you should discount his enthusiasm accordingly. But the discount does not get you to zero. The question that decides it is whether the context gap closes as models improve. If it does, Databricks is selling scaffolding for a building that finishes itself. If it does not, he may have identified one of the few durable moats in the industry, alongside distribution, workflow integration, and the ordinary friction of switching. 8 weeks after he made the argument, investors put $5 billion behind the context infrastructure he sells. So let me take the science fiction out of artificial general intelligence entirely and describe it as an economist would. Previous general-purpose technologies have both displaced and augmented labor. The loom removed some jobs and created others. The spreadsheet reduced the need for ledger clerks while increasing the output expected from financial professionals. Each changed the boundary between what people did and what machines did. AI pushes that boundary into cognitive work once treated as inherently human. For some tasks, the shift is not simply from an unproductive employee to a more productive one. It is from human hours to software, compute and vendor contracts. Some of that spending is capital expenditure. Much of it, under the accounting rules that actually apply, is a service consumed over a contract term. The cleaner economic point is this: cognition is becoming cheaper to buy without putting another person on the payroll. Watch how that is already showing up and note how carefully the numbers have to be read. Goldman Sachs research puts around 300 million full-time jobs globally in the exposed category, with roughly 2/3 of American occupations touched to some degree, and between a quarter and a half of the workload replaceable in the exposed ones. Their base case has enterprise adoption taking about a decade, with 6 to 7% of workers facing direct displacement along the way. On the observed effect so far, Goldman estimates that AI reduced monthly American payroll growth by roughly 16,000 jobs over the previous year. That is a modeled drag on hiring, not a count of 16,000 monthly redundancies. And Goldman says some offsetting job creation may not yet be visible in the estimate. Joseph Briggs, who co-leads their global economics team, has said that the big story in 2026 in labor will be AI. The first signs of pressure are appearing at the bottom rung, although the cause is not yet cleanly separable. The New York Federal Reserve puts unemployment among recent graduates, aged 22 to 27, at 5.6%, but its own research attributes much of the recent rise to the decline of entry-level learning and networking under remote work, with the timing pointing away from generative AI as the dominant cause so far. Goldman separately finds emerging AI effects concentrated among younger workers, and 1/3 of employers in a global graduate management recruiting survey said they had replaced at least some entry-level roles with AI. Note the mechanism because it matters more than the attribution. This is not a wave of dismissals. It is a hiring freeze at the entrance, Nobody gets a redundancy notice, so nobody counts it. Which raises the question the optimists have not answered. Every senior professional in Britain today was once somebody's expensive mistake. The trainee solicitor who took 4 hours over a task a partner did in 20 minutes was not being charged out at a profit. They were being manufactured. If the AI does the trainee's work at the trainee's quality for a rounding error, then the firm saves money this year and risks starving its future partnership pipeline. That is not a labour market problem. It is a supply chain problem, and it takes 20 years to show up and 20 years to fix. Then there is the demand paradox, which is the part that should trouble the people building this. Wages are not only a cost to the firm, they are the mechanism by which the public can afford to buy what firms produce. Taken to its limit, a collapse in the value of cognitive labour creates an economy capable of producing almost anything, populated by people who cannot buy it. Most serious remedies proposed so far involve redistribution in one form or another, whether that is a basic income, a tax on compute treated as a capital tax, or something not yet named. None of them are ready. But before any of that arrives, something more immediate is happening. Somebody has started to put a price on the human directly, and it is not the price we assumed. Which brings me to my Yorkshire Post column this week, adapted here. I do not rely on commentators to predict the future. I look where the money is. Opinions are cheap. Being prepared to lose money if you are wrong is different. The last American presidential election was a good example. In the autumn of 2024, news coverage was reporting a dead heat. National polls showed a slight lead for Harris, and many of the modelers were refraining from making calls. Prediction markets were more assertive. Around mid-October, Polymarket had Trump's likelihood of winning above 60% for the first time since July, and held the price there while the news outlets carried on describing a coin flip. The move was driven by a French trader known only as Theo. Theo believed the polls were missing voters for Trump, who were not willing to publicly support him, and instead of making a case, he paid YouGov to conduct private surveys for him in Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. Rather than ask people how they would vote, he asked them how they thought their neighbours would. What came back convinced him. He ultimately put more than $70 million at risk across several accounts and made approximately $85 million. Insurers do this, minus the drama, and they do it every day for every single risk that you can imagine. An underwriter's price, in fact, is the most honest opinion poll that exists, as getting it wrong costs the firm money, not credibility. This is why one event that happened to one of the companies at Yorkshire AI Labs has stuck with me. Lexcelerate is an AI law firm. After applying for professional indemnity cover and receiving an initial quote, they were asked to send their principals to London so the underwriters could review and evaluate the system and how it worked. Then came the questions, and all were focused on people. Can this be overridden by a human? Does a human determine that? Does a human type in the bank account number? Our assumption was that they wanted reassurance that a human remained in charge. In fact, they were looking to confirm the opposite. Every place where a human could intervene represented another place where something could go wrong. The updated quote came in 50% lower. I have been thinking about that number for a couple of weeks, because the entire public discussion regarding artificial intelligence has been centered on a phrase that nobody has bothered to test: the human in the loop. One underwriting team reached a different conclusion about this particular workflow. They were not saying machines are better than lawyers. They were saying that a controlled, logged, and bounded process was easier to price than an equivalent workflow containing several points of human discretion. A conveyancer can easily transpose 2 digits at the end of a working week. Discretion is where the money escapes, and discretion is precisely what a person brings. Once reasoning like this is assigned a cost, it becomes self-perpetuating. A firm that makes a partner review each and every file will simply be the expensive one. The same holds for diagnosis, for audit, for any professional service where somebody signs to say they looked. That signature becomes a cost-benefit problem. None of this means people should be lifted out of serious work. It means nobody had checked which of their interventions reduce risk, and one set of underwriters has started checking. Insurance is one of the few trades that has to put an explicit price on the cost of being wrong. What was raised in that room in London was an assumption none of us had thought to examine. That serious work needs a person inside every process. The quote suggested that in this workflow, human discretion was one of the things making the risk harder to price. One quote, one small firm, one afternoon in London. That is a signal, not a market. British guidance and sectoral regulation often default to human oversight, while data protection law preserves rights of intervention or challenge in certain significant automated decisions. The insurance quote raises a question those rules still need to answer. Which interventions reduce risk, and which merely add another source of it? The same question is waiting for auditors and consultants and anybody else who signs to say they checked. And when it reaches them, it will not arrive as an argument. It will arrive as a renewal. Now to the layoff tracker. This is the week 33 update, with filings and announcements confirmed through Friday, the 14th of August. Late reconciled notices from the previous week are identified separately. Synthesized from layoffs.fyi, layoff hedge, SkillSyncer, state-worn registries and filings with the Securities and Exchange Commission, for informational purposes only. Cross-sector year-to-date stands at 638,300 and above on the layoff hedge macro tracker. The strict technology baseline stands at 126,305. Both of those figures are provisional. Added in this update, roughly 1,575. The theme is the one Oracle has made impossible to ignore. Profitable companies are not cutting because revenue is falling. They are cutting while spending record sums on infrastructure, and payroll is the line item management controls most directly, Oracle first, and there is no number yet, but there is the clearest juxtaposition anyone has filed. In the financial year ended the 31st of May, Oracle reported approximately 141,000 full-time employees. That is down 21,000, or about 13%, from a year earlier. Revenue grew 17% over the same period. Capital expenditure hit $55.7 billion, up 162%, and free cash flow came in at negative $23.7 billion. The company raised $43 billion of debt and expects to raise roughly $40 billion more. Severance and exit costs reached $1.84 billion against $374 million a year earlier. Oracle's filing explicitly says that deploying AI across its operations has contributed to workforce reductions. It does not say that all 21,000 missing employees were removed because of AI, and a fall in reported headcount can include attrition and divestment as well as redundancy. Business Insider reports that managers have been told to compile lists ahead of the second fiscal quarter, opening on the 1st of September, with some teams facing double-digit percentage cuts. The juxtaposition is stark. A $638 billion backlog, including a reported 5-year $300 billion capacity commitment from OpenAI and record infrastructure spending, alongside a 13% fall in reported headcount. Essendant, 1,278. The largest single event in this update, and a reminder that AI is not the only thing hollowing out payrolls. Reconciled WARN filings now cover 1,278 positions, 644 in Illinois, 192 in Georgia, 150 in Pennsylvania, 136 in Texas, 103 in California, and 53 in Arizona. The notices state that the Staples subsidiary has been exploring asset sales and seeking capital to avoid liquidation of the company, and that it does not know whether those efforts will succeed. A law firm began investigating WARN compliance on the 10th of August. Large company technology cuts, 297. T-Mobile filed for 112 positions in Texas. Salesforce filed for 133 across Washington and California, spanning technical, administrative, and sales roles rather than any single function. Google's filing covers 52 roles in Puget Sound across technical, management, design, and recruiting, with no stated cause. Small numbers individually. Collectively, the expensive middle of the organization chart is now inside the scope of these filings. 3 items are carried but not counted, and I want to be explicit about why. Mercer International's 350 post reduction at Torgau in Germany is confirmed in filings, but it was announced on the 14th of July and merely restated in the 6th of August results. LegalZoom disclosed a workforce reduction as a percentage without publishing a head count, and reported figures differ, and Video Amp's 20% reduction appears on at least one tracker with a June date and needs reconciling. What I will be watching next, and this is my thesis rather than tracker data: Oracle before the 1st of September, legacy database and support benches at other enterprise software vendors, making the same infrastructure for headcount trade, and advertising measurement, where programmatic buying is moving towards agentic models. Final thought: hold the three stories together, and the shape becomes clearer. A man with a broken Commodore builds the company that now sits between enterprise data and artificial intelligence. He reaches my office because one of Hadoop's early developers is honest enough to recognize what comes next. 13 years later, Godsey argues that intelligence is no longer the scarce part. Context is, at the other end of the system, one London underwriting team prices a controlled workflow with fewer points of human intervention as lower risk. Oracle is increasing infrastructure spending while reporting 21,000 fewer employees than a year earlier. None of that proves that humans are obsolete or that artificial general intelligence has arrived. It does show that capital is already moving before the scientific argument is settled. Britain therefore needs a harder test than keep a human in the loop. Which human judgments catch harm, which introduce variance, which must remain, and what evidence supports them. Get that wrong, and we will not lose a philosophical argument. We will become the expensive country in a market that has learned to buy cheaper cognition. That is the Sunday Signal, issue 67. Thank you for listening. If this one made you think, please share it with somebody who needs to hear it, particularly anyone who signs their name to say they checked. The full newsletter with every source and the complete layoff tracker is free at thesundaysignal.ai. And separately, if you have not yet followed the show on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or YouTube, please do. It takes 10 seconds, and it makes the algorithm work for us rather than against us. Until next Sunday, I am David Richards, MBE. Thank you for listening to the Sunday Signal.